Judge Cahill has denied Attorney Ellison's request to amend the judge's sentencing memorandum. The document was issued immediately following the sentencing of Derek Chauvin. Judge Cahill said he wanted to explain to people how he reached his decision to give Chauvin 22 and a half years in prison.
And that is why, as opposed to trying to being profound here on the record, I prefer that you read the legal analysis that explains how I determined the sentence in this case.
After the document was published, Attorney Ellison wrote a letter to the judge saying, look, I need you to make some updates here. And not so that Chauvin can get more time, but just so that the record can be accurate. Pages 16 and 17, Keith Ellison says, are inaccurate. They say that the children who witnessed the murder of George Floyd are not traumatized, and Ellison says that is not true. But Ellison's request to change the documents have now been declined by Judge Cahill. Joining me now to discuss is New York Times bestselling author and trauma expert Resmaa Menakem and Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a world-renowned author, childhood development specialist, and a specialist on trauma as well. Dr. Gabor, I'll start with you. I understand you have some concerns about the judge's decision here.
Yeah, the judge came to the conclusion that these children were not traumatized, and there's no evidence that they weren't. I don't know what evidence might have been introduced at the trial to indicate that they were traumatized, but his summation of the reasons for his conclusion as to why they were not traumatized was completely incorrect so far as any proper understanding of trauma is concerned. And for example, he talked about that he saw the kids laughing and smiling and so on, and these are not indicators of no trauma. In fact, they can be indicators of trauma in the sense that when something uncomfortable is happening and painful is happening and terrifying is happening, which you have to assume was the child's actual experience, the laughter that the child might exhibit can be nothing but a protective mechanism on the part of their brain to defend them against the pain and the stress and the sheer horror of what's happening. So that's a conclusion that goes contrary to any understanding of trauma.
Black bodies are never given the benefit of being considered human. And that includes our children. And this is somebody, here's the thing that I want people to understand about Judge Cahill. Judge Cahill was a family court judge, which means that he understands and has had some training in actually how trauma works and what it does. And he has been, I would imagine that he's been trauma informed. And what I would tell you is he made a conscious decision to cast that aside and not give it the weight that it deserved. And that lets you know, that tells you everything you need to know about white body supremacy. That the white body being the supreme standard of human and structurally and philosophically is always at play in the background, especially as it relates to the Black body and indigenous body. And so what you saw with his ruling was a disregard of the humanness of these children. And so for me, this really speaks to his ruling speaks to a not a misunderstanding of trauma, a disregarding of trauma in order to make that ruling.
Well, the vast majority of cases that come in front of them, especially when they involve criminality and violence, have to do with traumatized people. And the courts are illiterate when it comes to trauma. I'm in Canada. This is true up here as well, but I follow the US as well, and my books are published there, and I'm often down there, and I speak with American legal personnel quite often, judges, and they're just not informed about trauma. It forms no part of their education, which means that they literally don't see what's in front of them, which is very often trauma and its impacts. So I think it's important in general for court judgments and court procedures to be trauma informed, which they're not. And in this case, if they really wanted to know the potential for these kids to have been traumatized, they should have brought in somebody who was educated about childhood trauma.
And Resmaa, why do you think that's significant? Why is it significant that with this specific case at this time that the judge acknowledges that these children have been traumatized? What difference does it make?
My humanity, my children's humanity should have been considered. And the reason why this is important is because as Attorney General Keith Ellison decided to write and address what has been done, this thing will live in the history books. This court case will live in the annals of law. So when you have young lawyers that are studying case law, this particular piece will be a part of that case law, right? These pieces, in terms of even if it doesn't get rectified, having it in as part of the record means that this needs to be considered. And so that's the beauty of, I think, with Attorney General Keith Ellison did, was he said, I want, if people are going to be looking at this case, 100 years from now, I want this to be on record as our children still were not considered to be human because they are housed in Black bodies, and that was wrong. And so that's why this is important. It's not just for right now, whether or not he reverses it and gives them more years or stuff like that. That would be some redress. What I am saying is that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, lawyers that are coming up, 5 years from now, lawyers that are coming up can actually use this as part of case law in order to continue to ask for and hopefully be granted some type of justice. Let me say it. Some type of accountability as it relates to this case and police and federal policing wreaking havoc on our bodies.
Look, this will not be a popular thing for me to say, but Chauvin, the cop who did this terrible deed, I'm sure he is a traumatized person, and I don't say that to gain sympathy or to justify what he did in any way at all. But when people are jailed, and the studies show that the vast majority of people that are jailed, particularly in the criminal courts, for drug use or for violence, these are traumatized people, traumatized in childhood. So the implication is not that people should get away with murder, far from it, but that the jail should really be an opportunity to rehabilitate people. And there are programs in U.S. prisons that I know about where they do this, where they actually take violent criminals, but they expose them to trauma-informed programs, and these people transform. They become different people. So that if you understood trauma, we would handle the schools differently, we would handle our jails differently. And let me tell you something else. As a physician, I could tell you that I could name you all the implications of trauma: depression, anxiety. I've written a book on ADHD. ADHD is another trauma outcome. Physical illnesses, such as some malignancies, like, for example, the more trauma a child has had, the greater the risk for cancer as an adult, or for autoimmune disease. Most physicians don't understand this because doctors are not very well trained to understand the mind-body unity.
Right.
But actually, in practice, so much of what we see as disease, I'm not saying are caused by trauma, but they're heavily influenced and potentiated by trauma. So an understanding of trauma would have deep and pervasive implications for education, for healthcare, and for the legal system.
And when I think about it, and even seeing Ellison's response, he wasn't making a correction in order to ask the judge that Chauvin get more time. It wasn't about Chauvin getting more time.
Right.
And so I thought it was very powerful that Ellison, as the AG, used his power
Yeah.
to address why it is so critical to acknowledge in a court document that these children have indeed been traumatized. And Resmaa, what it does for me is it makes me think about the role of our criminal justice system and the type of responsibility on the
Yes.
defendant who is found guilty. And
Right.
so even beyond restitution, even beyond serving time, there
Mhm.
has to be some broader acknowledgement of the people who witness this and the
Mm.
trauma it is that they have to suffer through. They have to learn how to cope and process. And
Yeah.
when you look too how trauma impacts people in
Mhm.
10, 20 years from now,
Yeah.
will these young people have overcome the trauma, or will they be suffering still from symptoms of that trauma? And what is the price that the defendant has to pay for that? And even a broader question, right? How then, within the criminal justice system, could we develop it so that there's resources put in place for people
Mm.
who we know these babies endure trauma? Why can't we build resources into this system so that they get what they need, so that in
Mhm.
10 and 20 years from now they're not strung out from on drugs, they're not
Mhm.
homeless, they're not,
Mhm. Mhm.
acting out in a violent way because
Mhm.
they never processed.
Right.
We could, if we, the court, acknowledged that there had been trauma,
Mhm.
we could start to put resources in place. But if we can't even acknowledge that there's been trauma,
Yeah.
how can we evolve the system to put preventative measures in place?
Well, sis, you're speaking about justice now, right? The things that you're saying would be that something is showing up and damaging people, and we have to make corrections in order for that damage to be uprooted, for it to be acknowledged, for it to be examined, for it to be interrogated. That's what you're saying. You're talking about justice. This system, as it relates to our people, has never been about justice. And what you're but before I go there, what I want to say to you, because you just so eloquently put this together, that what we know about trauma, without even going into a whole bunch of like citing different types of studies and stuff like that, one of the things that we know about trauma is that the trauma of our people, the enslavement of our people, the trauma of that has yet to be acknowledged. And even if it is acknowledged, there's no resources put behind the acknowledgement that the raping of our people for 200 and 250 years, the brutality, the flooding of our neighborhoods, the running highways through our neighborhoods, the feral policing that aligns itself with devout white body supremacists, right? That structural piece has yet to be addressed. And so the trauma of that has us now hurting each other. The trauma of that has us shooting each other, right? The trauma of that, but that's the invisible hand of white body supremacy, right? Because people will look at the young brother who shoots each other, right? Or the trauma or the domestic violence that happens in people's homes, or the sexual violence that happens, or whatever. We will look at that and say, that's a problem for those people. And you can do that as long as you don't examine it, right? If you examine this, then you realize that this whole structure has been put into place. So when something violent happens, there is no redress. So 20 years from now, coming from a dad who was addicted for years, right? And I love my dad because he eventually got himself together and was able to get help and is now sober. But me and him had an interesting conversation a couple weeks ago where for one of the first times in my dad's life, I heard him say that the trauma that he experienced impacted him for all of his life. My dad is 72 years old, and this is the first time he said that, at least the first time he said it to me. And the brutality of holding that all of those years of him growing up and being born in Alabama and having all of that stuff happen. And then by the time he got old enough to be in the world, he looked at, I need to protect myself from everybody. And so he lashed out at his own people at the same time that he loved his people. He lashed out and he lashed inward to himself. We as Black people, a lot of times don't account for the amount of trauma that this structural idea of white body supremacy literally has on our nervous system, has on our muscular system, has on our skeletal system, has on our endocrine system, has on our brain architecture. And so when we do something 20 years from now, we never put it back in the context of the brutality that has happened and continues to happen to us. And I think for us, this is why I think what Keith did was so important, is that we need to remember that when these children 20 years from now are struggling with relationship issues, are struggling with not being able to have children, are struggling with the cortisol that's floating around in their bloodstream, not just because of what happened to Brother George Floyd, but because of what happened to their people's, and it goes unaddressed. Those pieces are the important points that we have to begin to actually slow down and give credence to. But you're absolutely right, sis. We have to also put resources behind it and say, this is a thing that has occurred to our people for 400 years. And now when our people are hurting each other, or our people are being hurt, we have to have money or have to have resources available for that healing to take place. But this structure does not give a damn about our healing. It has no space. The most dangerous place for a Black body is in the mind of the white collective. And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a collective that does not see us as fully human. But I think with things like what you're saying and things like what Keith is saying, we have to continue to demand, just like what you're saying, that these things have redress. Black people, indigenous people, don't suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. We suffer from persistent and pervasive traumatic stress disorder. It is continuing, because it has never been acknowledged. And so when we watched, listen, I have not forgotten the murder, or not the murder. Well, I could say that the brutal beating of Rodney King. I haven't forgotten. I mean, that image was seared into my brain. Right? That's the first time you begin to see that type of stuff on moving pictures. Not now we've seen it in pictures because during lynchings, one of the things that white folks did is that they took pictures of it and then uses it as trading cards. But in moving pictures, Rodney King was one of the first time you saw it like that. And though that was re-traumatizing, right? This whole system is built on this feralness towards Black and indigenous bodies. And so when he did that, and it being caught in film like that, it tapped into a very old grief, a very old pain, a very old piece around horror and terror. And this is why me, I've been, the idea of reparations and repairing that is what we have to we have to continue to talk about and demand. In this country, the people that used to own our people, sis, they were the people that owned our people got reparations, but our people didn't. Just think about the upside downness of that. The people that owned our people got reparations for losing their property, but the people who were considered property did not get reparations. And that's that pain and that hurt and that grief. One of the things that I've been telling people is this: some of our elders have never gotten over the murder of Dr. King. Because when he got murdered, it wasn't like those people stopped murdering us. We had to override all of that pain and then continue to move forward, right? And I believe that murder is what ushered in the cocaine and in the 70s, and ushered in crack in the 80s, and ushered in all of these pieces for our elders trying to get from underneath that pain, ushered in the stuff that happened in the Black family. I believe that murder and that unresolved grief and that not dealing with that grief is why when you talk to our elders sometime about Dr. King or about the 60s, they go quiet. They avert their eyes. It's because there has been no language put around that grief that has never had redress. And so when we started using heroin, when we started using cocaine, everybody put that in the context of, oh, that's just what Black people do. And we did it to each other because we were all dealing with that pain. And so for me,